Hi, thanks for joining me. My name is Mindy Mandell, and on this channel, what I want to do is go through Plato's dialogues, and I've been looking for the continuity of thought that runs through all of them. And it's with that in mind that I've also now been looking at his letters. So last week I looked at the second letter. Today I'm going to be looking at the seventh. Now this letter was written somewhere around 355 or 6 BC, somewhere in that range. It's after Plato's second visit to Sicily, where he saw the tyrant Dionysius II. Some of the events of that are in the letter. I'm not really going to focus on that. What I will point out of that aspect of it is that Plato had a good friend named Dion, who is the person who had introduced Plato to Dionysius in the first place. Dion had challenged the power of Dionysius and was ultimately put to death for that. And this letter that we're looking at today is written to some of the friends and companions of Dion. The translator, by the way, that I'm using, same as I did with the second letter, L.A. Post. Now here we have Plato's views on slavery. He says, "Let not Sicily nor any city anywhere be subject to human masters. Such is my doctrine, but we should be subject to laws. Subjection is bad both for masters and for subjects, for themselves, for their children's children, and for all their posterity. The attempt to enslave others is altogether disastrous, and greed for such plunder is a trait of mean-souled and short-sighted characters, men who know nothing of what is good or what is just, here or hereafter, in God's sight or in man's." So maybe one uncomfortable point that some people have with Plato's dialogues is that there are mentions of slavery, and we never knew Plato's position on that subject, but here we have it. Now he has some interesting things to say about Dion and Dionysius. Remember, Dionysius was the tyrant who put Dion to death, and Plato had seen Dion as a person who could have potentially been that philosopher king that he wrote about in the Republic, or at least in the actual physical example of a actual ruler who was also a philosopher. Dionysius was someone that he had hoped would be that person, but he did not prove to be so. So here's what Plato says. He says, "Be guided also by the example of Dionysius and Dion. For of those two, the one who would not be convinced by philosophy is now leading an ignoble life, while he that was convinced by philosophy has met a noble death. For when a man makes the highest ideals his aim for himself and for his city, and accepts the consequences, in his fate there is nothing amiss or ignoble." Rather strong words. This is very much consistent with what Plato wrote in the dialogue Gorgias, and so that's a good one to look at if you haven't already seen it, if you want to see more on this topic. He goes into it in some detail. What he says here is this. He says, "Nothing good or evil worth considering befalls that which has no soul. Only to a soul either in the body or separated from it can good or evil occur. We must at all times give our unfeigned assent to the ancient and holy doctrines which warn us that our souls are immortal, that they are judged, and that they suffer the severest punishments after our separation from the body. Hence, we must also hold it a lesser evil to be victims of great wrongs and crimes than to be doers of them." And again, that is the theme of the dialogue Gorgias, and he goes into far more detail supporting this position in that dialogue. Now, from here he goes into a bit about the secrecy that needs to be around truth. There was a little bit of this in the second letter. He goes into more detail here. He says, "I certainly have composed no work in regard to it, to truth, nor shall I ever do so in the future, for there is no way of putting it in words like other studies. Acquaintance with it must come rather after a long period of attendance or instruction in the subject itself, and of close companionship, when suddenly, like a blaze kindled by a leaping spark, it is generated in the soul, and at once becomes self-sustaining." So a very beautiful line, often quoted one as well. If I thought it possible to deal adequately with the subject in a treatise or a lecture for the general public, what finer achievement would there have been in my life than to write a work of great benefit to mankind and to bring the nature of things to light for all men? One more quote here. I do not, however, think the attempt to tell mankind of these matters a good thing, except in the case of some few who are capable of discovering the truth for themselves with a little guidance. In the case of the rest, to do so would excite in some an unjustified contempt in a thoroughly offensive fashion. In others, certain lofty and vain hopes, as if they had acquired some awesome lore. Okay, so this is why he decided to put these sorts of teachings, these most profound teachings, in his letters only. Well, he does go on to talk about things in themselves, and he talks about them at a depth that he doesn't quite do in the Republic, although hints of it are there. If you know that this is his thinking, you can recognize it in the Republic. All right, he says that for everything that exists, there are three classes of objects through which knowledge about it must come. The knowledge itself is a fourth, and we must put as a fifth entity the actual object of knowledge, which is the true reality. So here, notice he's separating the knowledge from the object of knowledge. And so this is like having the divided line in Book 6 of the Republic, showing the cognitive functions, separate from the objects of knowledge. That's also in at the end of Book 5 of the Republic. He does say that opinion and knowledge function at different powers, and they have different objects. And then he gives us the divided line in Book 6. Okay, so he gives us an example, a circle. So this is to get the first three classes. Okay, fourth is the knowledge, fifth is the object of knowledge. But what about those first three? So using a circle as an example, the first thing is the name, which is in English circle. And then there's a description. So he gives this example of a circle. He says, the thing which has everywhere equal distances between its extremes and its center. And then also image. And so this would be like a drawing, like what you're seeing here on the screen, or objects which are drawn and erased and turned on a lathe and destroyed. So these are the first three categories. And then about the fourth, in the fourth place, there are knowledge and understanding and correct opinion concerning them, all of which we must set down as one thing more that is found not in sounds nor in shapes of bodies, but in minds, whereby it evidently differs in its nature from the real circle and from the aforementioned three. Okay, so here he's going to the divided line again. This is another way to read the divided line. That had four parts, but if you take out sensory perception and you look at belief as correct opinion, because here we're looking towards something that is real, then you have these three categories. And these are in the mind, whereas the other three are more of sensory perceptions and sounds or visuals and so on. But here this is in the mind, but still this is separate from the fifth. And he says that if a man does not somehow or other get hold of the first four, he will never gain a complete understanding of the fifth. On the surface, it seems clear enough. Okay, the knowledge is separate from the thing itself, and that's why the fourth and fifth are separate. But then when you think about it more deeply, you say, wait a minute, what exactly is the difference between the fourth, which is the knowledge of the thing itself, and the fifth, which is a complete understanding? What does it mean to have a complete understanding of the fifth, separate from the fourth? Yes, we can separate in our minds the knowledge from the object of knowledge, but to understand that object, is that the same as knowledge, or is that something different? How do you really distinguish in experience the fourth from the fifth? And so that's a question to hold on to as we continue. All right, again, however, the meaning of what has just been said must be explained. Every circle that is drawn or turned on a lathe in actual operations abounds in the opposite of the fifth entity, for it everywhere touches the straight, while the real circle I maintain contains in itself neither much nor little of the opposite character. Names, I maintain, are in no case stable. Nothing prevents the things that are now called round from being called straight, and the straight round. And those who have transposed the names and used them in the opposite way will find them no less stable than they are now. The same thing, for that matter, is true of a description, since it consists of nouns and of verbal expressions, so that in a description there is nowhere any sure ground that is sure enough. One might, however, speak forever about the inaccurate character of each of the four, and indeed many philosophers have done so. And I think this is probably where also the idea of existentialism started, the idea that even if there is truth, we can't know it or be sure that we know it. And so that is also a philosophical position that you'll hear quite a bit about, and you can talk forever about the inaccurate character of each of these four. The important thing is that, as I said a little earlier, there are two things. There is the essential reality and then the particular qualities. And when the mind is in quest of knowledge, not of the particular, but of the essential, each of the four confronts the mind with the unsought particular, whether in verbal or in bodily form. Each of the four makes the reality that is expressed in words or illustrated in objects liable to easy refutation by the evidence of the senses. The result of this is to make practically everybody a prey to complete perplexity and uncertainty. And so here he's going back into something that he did touch on in the second letter as well, the idea that this study is different from other studies, and that the things in themselves that we want to know have no affinity to our minds or to the other four, to the areas of study that we're used to, that we're comfortable working in. There's something completely different going on here, and it leaves us in perplexity and uncertainty. Natural intelligence and a good memory are equally powerless to aid the person who has not an inborn affinity with the subject. Without such endowments, there is, of course, not the slightest possibility. Hence, all who have no natural aptitude for and affinity with justice and all the other noble ideals, though in the study of other matters they may be both intelligent and retentive. All those, too, who have affinity, but they're kind of stupid and unretentive, well, such will never, any of them, attain to an understanding of the most complete truth in regard to moral concepts. And so here's where we're going to end it. Here's where he gives us what we need to see the difference between what he's calling the fourth and the fifth. The study of virtue and vice must be accompanied by an inquiry into what is false and true of existence in general, and it must be carried on by constant practice throughout a long period, as I said in the beginning. Hardly after practicing detailed comparisons of names and definitions and visuals and other sense perceptions, after scrutinizing them in benevolent disputation by the use of question and answer without jealousy, at last in a flash, understanding of each blazes up, and the mind, as it exerts all its power to the limit of human capacity, is flooded with light. Okay, so it's a very beautiful quote, but it does need some unpacking. First of all, notice here that what he's talking about is doing dialectic, scrutinizing with benevolent disposition by the use of question and answer without jealousy. This is a description of the highest use of dialectic, as described in the Republic and other places as well. And then he says that in a flash there's understanding. Now notice here that this understanding is a different understanding than what we see on the divided line. This is a higher understanding. What we see on the divided line, the highest is knowledge, and knowledge requires a knower and a known. However, when you get to this level of understanding, it's in a flash that you're suddenly one with it. And this is what mystics often describe as that highest experience, that mystical experience, often called satori or enlightenment or things like this. It's an understanding that's maybe more of a recognition of what is, because there is no separation of knower and known, and you're just suddenly flooded with light. And so to have an understanding, a complete understanding of the fifth, is something different from the knowledge of the fourth as known on the divided line. And so that is what he tells us in his 7th letter. And I'm going to leave it at that. If you have any questions or comments, you can leave them below. There's also always an email address in the description box. As always, if you like what you're seeing, I'd appreciate, I lost my voice there. If you like what you're seeing, I'd appreciate a thumbs up. And also, if you don't already subscribe, please think about it. I do put out new videos each week. You can get a notification of that. And also think about sharing with your friends. You'll have someone to talk to these things about. Next week, we're going to go back to the dialogues. This time, I'm going to go to one called Epinomis. This is a very curious one. The title Epinomis in Greek actually means after the laws, so it's meant to follow the laws. However, I'm going to cover it before, and that's because this one is very likely a spurious dialogue. It's one that it's up for debate, and in fact, people who tend to be drawn towards the spiritual side of Platonism tend to want to embrace this dialogue. On this one, I think I'm going to have to side with the academics and say this one is probably spurious. But there are some good things in it it's worth looking at. And also next week, I'll explain why I think ultimately it's not an authentic dialogue of Plato's. So I do hope you'll join me for that. Thank you very much.